Yeah, uh, very good afternoon, friends. Welcome you all to the second webinar series on COVID by Clinical Infectious Disease Society. And today's panel discussion will be on the infection control problems that we all face on a day-to-day basis in managing patients with COVID. As we all know that the clinical management of those patients is fairly easy. It's the infection control issues which really creates a lot of problems from the healthcare workers side. And for that, we have Dr. Tanu Singhal, who is an infectious disease consultant. She's a pediatric infectious disease person. She takes care of infection control at a hospital in Mumbai. And she's one of those earliest people to train in ID from Hinduja Hospital under Dr. Rajiv Soman. And actually, we are supposed to have three panelists. Anup will, Dr. Anup Varia from Kochi, again, who is doing infection control at Aster Medicity. He will be joining us soon. But we have Dr. Priscilla Rupali with us. She is the professor of medicine and infectious diseases at Christian Medical College, Vellore. And she is also the HICC co-chair at CMC Vellore. I think infection control in CMC Vellore will be a big challenge with the multitude of patients, the huge number of patients with the general wards, ICU, bone marrow transplants, whatnot. So that'll be a big challenge there. And then we have Dr. Ravikant Porwal, who is an ID physician who trained with us at Apollo Hospitals, Chennai. And then probably, as far as I know, he's the only ID physician in Jaipur and probably in Rajasthan too, in terms of ID training. And he is also into clinical ID plus infection control at his hospital, which is an NABH accredited hospital. So we have chosen people who handle patients with COVID on a day-to-day basis and who are also responsible for infection control activities in their hospital so that we can learn from them or unlearn from them whatever we need to do on managing this problem. And as usual, this webinar will be streamed across live through Zoom plus the YouTube. People who join in late or who miss the action today can have to type SIDS webinar in YouTube, and then you will have access to it. And with this, probably we'll start the session when Dr. Anup Warrior could join with those Wi-Fi issues being settled, probably another 5-10 minutes is expected to join, but we will not wait. We will start the session. Off to Dr. Tanu Singhal to start the session.
Yeah, hi. Good afternoon, everybody. And it gives me a pleasure to host this webinar. Basically, I think what makes COVID-19 very different from other infections is that there are so many infection control issues to look after. And I would say it's like a hydra-headed monster because you solve one infection control issue and a new one emerges. And the basics of infection control in COVID have been dealt with in the previous two webinars. And, these were done on 11th April and 14th April. And you can, go through those webinars if you've not attended them for, basics about PPE and triage, etc., etc. And what we are going to do in today's webinar is discuss real life situations and how they were managed. Now, before we go on to these cases, I have some disclosures to make. That first of all, these cases are from a tertiary care hospital that has both COVID and non-COVID patients. So we treat both, like in Mumbai, that's how it is, that all private hospitals have to have COVID beds in their facility. And also we have a single negative pressure unit that has COVID positive and suspect patients. So the entry to the unit is the same, but they are two separate areas. And we also have in-house testing for COVID in our hospital with a turnaround time of 6 to 24 hours. And also we must remember that we are talking from Mumbai, which is one of the epicenters of the outbreak in India. Now, our unit follows protocols which are amalgamation of WHO, ICMR, the Mumbai Municipal Corporation, as well as international guidelines. And when I will present these cases, you will understand that there are no black and white answers to many of these issues. And I mean, while you can take pointers from these cases, you also have to learn that you'll have to design your own site-specific solutions, your own solutions depending on what logistics you have. And then finally, it's basically rationality and common sense approach which is needed in many of these instances. So, with that kind of brief introduction, let me come to the first case. And this case had presented to us about a month ago. And this is a 52-year-old female with obstructive airway disease, for which she was taking metered dose inhalers. And then she started having fever, cough, breathlessness. So she didn't have any history of travel or contact with the sick patient. And remember, this was 1 month ago when cases of COVID were not as many as they are now. She was admitted at a government facility in Mumbai as a COVID suspect because she satisfied the SARI definition. She was started on antibiotics and oxygen. And 24 hours later, her COVID test came back negative. So now, once this test came back negative, the patient's general condition in terms of her respiratory status was not improving, and hence she was transferred to our hospital with a COVID test negative report. So now let me ask the first question to Dr. Priscilla, that if you have a patient who comes with a SARI-like illness and who has one COVID swab negative, and where are you going to kind of admit this patient? Are you going to keep her in the general intensive care unit, or would you put this patient in a suspect unit? How would you approach this?
Yeah, hi, thanks, Tanu. And just like you have your disclaimers, I'm going to have mine too. I also work in a tertiary care center. And as you rightly mentioned, our protocols are also an amalgamation of a lot of things with the WHO, Ministry of Health, and what we think would work in our setting. So with regard to this lady, like you rightly said, this is a 52-year-old lady, and she has an underlying comorbidity, a chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. She definitely has presented to us with a severe acute respiratory illness, or a SARI, and she was admitted there in a COVID unit, but now is being transferred. And believe me, this is a very common occurrence here. So what I would actually do is what we would do is, because she was tested outside, we would definitely admit her into our isolation ward. And our isolation ward is slightly more in the sense that it actually has multi-para monitors. It has oxygen facilities. So it may not be the same elsewhere. So for us, admitting her in isolation ward would actually be okay. We do have nurses who will be able to monitor them, and we have pulse oximeters for every bed. We have about 23 beds, and we have about 5 pulse oximeters to monitor these patients. So for us, I would actually admit her in actually a COVID positive unit, which will be akin to what we would call our isolation ward. We wouldn't admit such a patient to an ICU just as yet, but if we found that she was worsening, then we would probably take her into an ICU setting. So at the moment, if she was saturating more than 90%, we would probably be observing her in the isolation ward, which actually has facilities for close monitoring.
But let us say this patient on arrival is critical and she's on oxygen and she's desaturating and she needs critical care support. So where would you then put her?
Okay, so what we have actually done in our setting is actually we have divided our ICU into 2 areas. So we actually converted our high dependency unit into a non-COVID area, and our MICU into 2 areas where we would actually be admitting suspects as well as confirmed cases. So we do have some isolation areas, 2 isolation areas where we can actually admit confirmed sick patients. So if I found that her saturation was less than 90% on initial vital evaluation, I would actually put her straight away into an intensive care setting where there is some isolation facility with some negative pressure ventilation. We don't really have a foolproof negative pressure ventilation. We have indigenously designed some rooms in our isolation ward as well as our ICU, where we have a big exhaust which actually simulates a negative pressure situation. So we did that during the first Singapore SARS outbreak, and luckily that has held us in good stead for this one.
So I think the main message which goes out here is that though this patient has come with a negative COVID report, she is still a suspect, because you know that the sensitivity of the test is only about 50 to 70%. So so it doesn't mean that, you know, she's not COVID. She's still a suspect, and it wouldn't be a good idea to put these patients into the general intensive care unit without isolation. So she's admitted in a negative pressure single ICU room in our hospital. She's tachycardic, saturation is 91% on room air, she's febrile, blood pressure is 90/70, she's initiated on NIV, she's given antibiotics, and because she has a history of obstructive airway disease, even steroids are started. And in this kind of negative pressure isolation unit, the staff is wearing linen gowns, simple surgical masks, they're not having N95 masks, and she's investigated. Now, when her investigations come back, because in the previous hospital where she was, they didn't do many tests to find out what was the etiology of SARI except for a throat swab. We find that she's actually having a normal count with lymphopenia. She has a ANC-ALC ratio which is more than 6.5. She has platelets which are normal. She has elevated CRP, and her creatinine is elevated. Her D-dimer is high. CPK is mildly elevated, LDH is mildly elevated. Her blood cultures are sent, and her upper respiratory biofire done for other viruses is negative. And we also get an X-ray done, which shows that there are some consolidations, primarily in the lower zone, and a CT chest is done, which is reported as showing features of air trapping, but also showing subpleural consolidations, etc., which our radiologists say is that you know, these are intermediate for COVID. Okay, so now with these kind of investigations that are available to us, could this be COVID? With I mean, Dr. Ravikant, I would like to ask you, with this kind of picture, despite the patient have a negative swab, could this still be COVID?
Yeah, I would still think that this could be COVID, because there's a fairly compatible picture. SARI at the presentation, there's lymphopenia, there is D-dimer which is raised, and there's CRP which is raised. There are subpleural consolidation, peripherally situated. Although there is not bilateral diffuse ground glassing, which is typical of COVID, but I would still consider COVID as a significant possibility in this particular situation.
So basically, you know, that's why we didn't find an alternative cause for her respiratory illness. She didn't have flu, etc. And the investigations and CT scan were suggestive. And therefore, this patient, we transferred her to the COVID unit 18 hours after arrival. And after that, we sent a repeat swab sent from the unit, which was positive. And this is definitely severe COVID-19, which we were suspecting right from the beginning. And this case just says that one negative swab does not rule out COVID. In fact, two negative swabs also don't rule out COVID, especially if the patient has come in later stages of the illness where the swabs may become negative. And there are a lot of factors which determine the positivity of the swab, like if it has not been collected appropriately, if it has not been transported, your swabs could be negative. Now we are left with those 18 hours when the patient was not in the COVID unit, and you have a variety of staff which has, you know, encountered these patients. And I'll just give you a brief idea of this staff. So there was one doctor and nurse who applied NIV to this patient, and they were wearing medical masks at this time. You had one junior doctor who took history, and after removing the NIV and auscultated the chest, touched without gloves, spent about 15 minutes in the room and was wearing a medical 3-ply mask, not an N95 mask. You had one consultant who spent 1 minute in the room but did not touch the patient. He was wearing an N95 mask. You had 3 nurses in the room for variable time who were wearing linen gown and medical mask. And you had one HCA who entered the room with a cloth mask. And you all know this is what happens when you have a patient who's sick. You have multiple people who have had encounter with the patients. And so I would like to ask maybe Dr. Ravikant here, that how would you classify these exposures? Are these like kind of low risk exposures, medium risk exposures, or high risk exposures in each of these patients? And can you be very quick about it, so that, because you know we have a lot of cases.
Yeah, so I think in the given scenario, we'll have to take the guidance from CDC guidelines regarding healthcare personal exposure, which clearly classifies into high, medium, and low risk category. So apart from the consultant in the previous slide who was wearing N95 and was there only for a brief interaction, Possibly other majority of your healthcare personnel was only wearing a simple surgical mask without the adequate PPE. And when actually the patient was on NIV or the NIV was off, which is considered as an aerosol generating procedure. So I would consider them as a medium to high risk exposure. And apart from the consultant, where actually I could think that it could be only a low risk exposure because he was wearing an N95 respirator, although the face shield and goggles were not there even on the consultant face. So probably I think most of your healthcare personnel in this particular case got exposed to medium to high risk exposure.
Yes, so I think that is what it is. So I think the basic thing is the mask. So if the source is wearing a mask and the healthcare person is wearing a mask, automatically your risk of exposure goes down. The highest risk is when the source is not wearing the mask and this is not wearing the mask. So, so I agree. And if there is an aerosol generating procedure, you go one level up. And if you're like handling the patient, like proning, your level of exposure goes one. So we also kind of ascertain this. And we felt that the first two group of people had medium level of exposures. And the other people, like, the nurses who were only in the room for a variable time and didn't really go near the patient, etc., they were at low risk. And the HCA who entered the room with a cloth mask was also actually at low risk. So we kind of categorize these exposures as medium, but yes, there can be a difference that these could be medium to high risk exposures. So how are you going to kind of manage these exposures, Dr. Ravikant, the medium level exposures and the low level? What will you do about quarantining of these healthcare workers? And will you give them HCQ prophylaxis? And what about testing them?
Yeah, so all the medium risk exposure who were not wearing the adequate PPE, as we have already discussed, have to be quarantined, have to be excluded from the work for at least 14 days duration. While the low risk exposures need not to exclude from the work, except the self delegated supervision, like twice a day temperature, closely watch regarding the symptomatology. If they develop fever, respiratory symptoms, etc., needs to be checked on daily basis with the healthcare personnel who have been exposed with the low risk. As far as the HCQS prophylaxis, probably I will not advise HCQS prophylaxis because of the positive data into the literature. But yes, if some of the staff comes up in front and asks me the HCQS prophylaxis, I will definitely provide because there is a ICMR recommendation. So if any staff asks me, I would give it, but I will not actively give HCQS prophylaxis because there is not a strong data. As far as the testing is concerned, possibly the people who have the medium to high risk exposure would definitely need testing, but low risk exposure healthcare person would definitely does not require any sort of COVID testing.
So when would you test these people with medium or high risk exposure?
I think I will not test them. Basically, if they are asymptomatic, I will only tell them to go for quarantine. But the moment they become symptomatic, I will immediately test them.
Dr. Priscilla, would you also agree with this? Or
yes, Tanu, actually that is exactly what I would do. I agree with Ravikant. We do not actually advocate testing unless the healthcare worker becomes symptomatic. So definitely there was risk exposure here, medium risk exposure, especially with NIV, which is actually a very high aerosol generating procedure. So just like you absolutely said, we would quarantine them. We actually quarantine them for 14 days if it's medium and high risk. And if it is low risk, we would say, okay, monitor yourself for 7 days, monitor your temperature. If you have any symptoms, then please do come back. We will test you at that point in time. So that is what we would actually do. So we do slightly different, maybe low risk, we would quarantine them for 7 days. And then we ask them to observe for appearance of symptoms. If we find that they've been okay through these 7 days, we actually would ask them to come back to work. Yeah, that's what we do.
So I think the main messages here are that you classify the exposures, you quarantine people with high or medium risk exposure, monitor their temperatures, and the duration for which you quarantine is actually variable because it also depends on how many resources you have, how many patients you are getting. Because if, like for us, we are quarantining for 5 to 7 days because, there's so many patients and there's so many healthcare exposures. If we quarantine for 14 days, we'll not be left with people. So I think that is a little bit variable, and we don't test asymptomatic. contacts. That's absolutely important. And I mean, this patient actually did well. Luckily, she went home and none of the contacts developed any symptoms. And all joined duty after 7 days. Now, let's go on to the second case. And Dr. Anup, are you there?
Yes, Dr. Dhamma, I'm there. Yes.
Welcome, Dr. Anup. So let's come to the second scenario, and let's say this is also a real thing. There's a 36-year-old female. She's diagnosed with breast cancer during the timing of this COVID pandemic, needs urgent surgery. No family members are sick, but she lives in a building which has been sealed, as one family in that building in which she stays is COVID positive. And now when she approaches the hospital because this is clearly emergency surgery, you can't wait for 4 weeks here, the surgeon asks for pre-operative COVID testing. Okay. So now the question which I have to you, Dr. Anup, is what is your response to the surgeon? And do you think pre-op testing should be done for COVID in the current scenario? What about doing testing for all elective surgeries? And finally, what is actually happening all over the world, in India and in different places about this? Because this is a burning question right now.
Right. So when you talk about the surgeries and preoperative screening, the American College of Surgeons have come about with a triaging guideline and to classify whether it's an emergency, urgent or elective surgery. And in this case, as you have mentioned, when it's urgent, then we are committed to doing the surgery as soon as possible. So in these cases, most of the professional societies, be it in case of cardiology or be it in case of surgery or neurosurgery, most of the professional societies have actually come ahead and recommended preoperative screening. So most of the professional society guidelines say that if you have facility, please go ahead and screen and test before the surgery part. Now, if you look at what kind of benefit it gives, now for the healthcare worker, I don't think that a preoperative screening or a negative preoperative screening will help us to avoid precautions or reduce the level of precautions, because like in the previous case, which you very clearly illustrated, a single RT-PCR test has got significant limitations, and based on even a 2 negative RT-PCRs at a definite intervals, still it doesn't mean that we'll be able to lower our precautions or our preventive aspects for transmission to the healthcare workers. However, it might change our management in the post-operative period in terms where will you place the patient, will you place him in an isolation, post-operative ICU, away from the patients, etc. Also, there are a couple of studies which are maybe one or very small, maybe 1 or 2 observational studies which are looked at the outcome in those patients who are tested to be COVID positive before the emergency surgeries, and apparently their prognosis in terms of morbidity and mortality was higher compared to those who tested negative. So this is something which we can prognosticate and counsel our patients also, that yes, because of the emergency nature of your surgery, we are going ahead and performing it. But because you are COVID positive in the preoperative period, you are likely to have more morbidity and mortality in terms of the patient outcome. While I would not change, or I would not make any changes in the precautions which the surgeon or the other healthcare workers would take during management of the surgery or of this patient.
Yeah, so I think I agree with you that we don't still have ICMR recommendations on this pre-op surgical testing, but most hospitals are testing, I think, I think as if the epidemic kind of progresses the way it is, then this will probably do it. And most of the times, you know, I mean, that's my feeling, that it is done by the surgeons, not for the benefit of the patient though. It is done for the benefit because somehow they feel better and they feel less scared about doing surgery on these patients if they are COVID negative. Because, you know, there is a lot of mind battle here. A lot of things in the COVID situation are not evidence-based, but you have to somehow, you know, work on the mind as well. And, you know, to put this in a different way, I mean, I just wanted to share this experience that a patient diagnosed with prostatic cancer had been advised urgent cancer surgery at our hospital. And this is a real thing. Just day before yesterday, she sets up a Skype appointment with me and wishes to know what is the infection control procedure in my hospital? How do we test staff? How many staff have turned positive in our hospital? Is there mixing of COVID-19 and non-COVID-19 staff? This has actually happened. She wanted to know of us, where do the people who work in the COVID unit stay? Where do the nurses, other nurses stay? Is there any mixing of the nurses? How many nurses turn positive? So while doctors are worried about operating on COVID positive patients, even COVID patients are being worried about getting operated by teams which may be positive. And I don't know whether it will come, whether patients will ask for COVID testing of the operating team. Of course, that might not happen, because where will they go otherwise? But I mean, we have to look at it from the other way. So do you also see this? Patients reluctant to come to hospitals because postponing even urgent surgeries because they're scared of getting COVID from the hospital. Dr. Ravikant or Priscilla, anybody?
Yeah, I would say that there is definitely a scare among the patient as well. And they are also not coming upfront for every normal things. But if some kind of urgent cancer surgeries are coming, at least in a town like Jaipur, people are coming to hospitals. And I have not come across this kind of funny situation where patient relative has asked me what is your dates and how many staff are calling it.
Okay. So that's also what.
Let me share what we've been asked. We've actually been asked about infection control procedures, definitely. But so far, nobody's asked for COVID testing of the operating team. So luckily, because the whole hospital has turned upside down here with regard to this pandemic, we've been able to actually separate COVID areas and non-COVID areas in the hospital. So we're able to, with some degree of confidence, able to tell people that we are not mixing the staff who are working in these different areas. But it's not perfect. I totally agree. And it's not Mumbai. We're in Vellore, which is Hicktown. So.
Okay, so let's go on to the fourth case. This is a patient with end-stage renal disease being dialyzed in our hospital. She has a permacath. She's not functioning well and a fistula is needed. So the urologist asks for a pre-op COVID testing. This happened about 3 weeks ago, and she's COVID positive. And so obviously there's no chance of surgery here for now, because it's actually a fistula, which is not that urgent. But look at what has happened because of this testing. So the question is that, how are you going to trace contacts for this patient? Will you only trace contacts for the day that she was detected positive, or for 48 hours before that? Dr. Anu, would you like to say? When do you think, like, let's say she underwent dialysis on Thursday where she tested positive, would you actually also look at people who have been looking after her on Tuesday?
So here you have two groups, or maybe even three groups. You have your family contacts, you have the healthcare worker contacts within the dialysis unit, and probably you also have contacts in the waiting area. I'm not sure if she came in and she had a waiting period in the, before the dialysis session was scheduled. So when you do the contact tracing, you have to tick off all these three: the healthcare workers in the dialysis unit, the waiting area where she could have contact with other patients, patient attenders, family, and her household contacts. And if you ask about the duration for how long you should track, so that is a very dicey question. I don't think there's a very clear-cut answer whether 48 hours is enough, or 72 hours is needed, or 5 days is needed. But definitely in terms of risk assessment, last we discussed earlier, the duration of time and the household contact definitely being high risk. Here you have mentioned that in the dialysis patients, all of them are wearing masks, and you have also mentioned that the staffs wear masks, gown and gloves. Hence, based on the previous classification, I guess the level of risk for staff here is actually will be low risk, because though they have spent time, they have been wearing appropriate PPE, and no aerosol generating procedure was done in the dialysis as far as the information is provided. But the same may not be true for household contacts, and in the waiting area, if there is any information whether all patients are wearing masks in the waiting area also.
Yeah, so basically, we quarantined the staff who cared for the patient on that day and 48 hours earlier, because that was our primary thing. Because at that time, they were very apprehensive. And I must tell you that all the nurses who had contact with the patient had reported for 5 days symptoms of choking, tightness in the chest, sleeplessness, sore throat, but no fever. So, the kind of mental trauma also which nurses and all undergo is significant when they come to know that they have looked after a COVID positive patient. And here I would just like to kind of share that it's a hotbed of COVID in Mumbai, the dialysis units. And about 2-3 weeks ago, there were many dialysis centers which were closed because of patients turning positive there. And, the dialysis patients had a tough time, because where would they go for dialysis? And in fact, in BM, what is being recommended here in Mumbai is that HCQ to all staff, nurses and technicians in the dialysis unit. is being recommended. So you can just understand where this is going to. And even before this incident happened, we did some things which helped us, in managing this case, because what we did is screening at entry, so that nobody who has cold, cough, or fever enters the dialysis unit. We stopped relatives coming inside the unit. We made it sure that all patients wear masks when they are in the unit. And earlier, when patients were on dialysis, they were served food, tea, etc. So we stopped that, because that once they are eating something, they would take their masks off. We made it clear that all staff wear surgical mask, linen gown, and gloves when they're handling these patients, and cleaning with hypochlorite after every shift. So fortunately, there were no further cases which happened, but we've not screened our dialysis patients. So we don't know whether there's still some asymptomatic people who are infected floating around. But we must understand that some areas of the hospital, like chemotherapy areas, dialysis areas, are at high risk for, transmission of COVID between patients. Now, coming to the next question, we have one nurse who has been working in a non-COVID ICU. She has high fever of 1 day with no other respiratory symptoms. She is unremarkable except for tachycardia and toxic look. She has a white cell count of 5,800, 80% polys and 16% lymphocytes. Platelets are a little low. CRP is negative. Malaria is negative. So my question to Dr. Priscilla here is, are you going to test her for COVID?
Okay, so Tanu, this lady is working in a non-COVID area, and she has a high fever of just 1 day and no respiratory symptoms. And she seems fairly okay, except for a toxic look, and she has a bit of tachycardia, and the rest of the tests are pretty unremarkable. So I would not actually test her for COVID. Though we are in a COVID pandemic situation, is it possible that she has COVID? Of course, it's possible, and the likelihood that she acquired it from the hospital is there. It's also likely that she acquired it from the community. But with a high fever of 1 day, she would not fulfill criteria enough for me to actually consider testing for COVID. Now, what would I do with her if I just found that she had high fever for 1 day? I would ask her to take off, monitor herself day and night for about a week or so, see if she's developing any respiratory symptoms. And if she's developing respiratory symptoms, then I would think in terms of testing her. But at this point in time, with just a fever for 1 day, I would give her off, but I would not really test her.
Do any of the panelists have any difference of opinion here? So I think...
I like to come in here for a moment. So two things from my side. One is that if you look at the ICMR indication, so they go on to say that even category A or mildly symptomatic healthcare workers fulfill the need for screening for COVID, at least as far as the ICMR indications for screening goes. And second, with the healthcare worker, there is a lot of implication on contact tracing with what kind of patients they have taken care, and where are the other healthcare workers who had contact with them working now, and to what kind of patients they are providing care. So when it comes to healthcare worker, you have two implications. One, that the ICMR advocates that even minor symptoms, healthcare workers with minor symptoms be screened for COVID. Plus there's an implication on the contact tracing and how the other healthcare workers who are in contact are providing care. So in my scenario, I would actually go ahead and test her.
Okay, so of course, but the ICMR criteria says fever with either cough or breathing difficulty. So just fever alone is not a criteria.
Okay. So it says that even mild. It doesn't illustrate on the type of symptoms. It just says mild symptoms or with in a healthcare worker.
Okay.
Plus, as I mentioned, from my side, I feel there is a lot of implications on the contact tracing. So if this nurse is detected to be positive, there are a lot of implications on what kind of, where does she live in the hostel, what are the other nurses who live with her, where are those nurses posted. Now, if you wait for a week, and then if she comes back as positive, and she has transmitted this disease already to a group of people in her hostel or at her workplace, and they have been continuing to provide care for other patients, you are sort of putting at risk a lot of the system, a lot of things in the system.
Okay, so we did go ahead and test her because we are in an epicenter, and she did test positive for COVID. She's admitted as per protocol in Mumbai. Everybody who's positive for COVID, whether they have mild or severe symptoms, she does well. Now the question here is to Dr. Ravikant, what will you do about the staff of the ICU where she has been working and the patients that she has been looking after there, but she was always wearing a mask and others were also wearing a mask. And second is the nursing hostel where she stays. Because as Dr. Anup rightly said, that hostel has 15, she has 15 flatmates in a 4-room flat. There is a common dining area, and the total nurses in the hostel are 900. And remember, when these nurses go back to the hostel, they are not wearing masks. So you have a kind of a low risk exposure in the hospital, but you have high risk exposure in the hostel. What would you do?
Yeah, so as I think you rightly said that in the hospital, at least if she was wearing a mask and she did not have any respiratory symptoms and others were also wearing a mask, it was a low risk exposure. So probably we have to closely watch for the symptoms and closely checking their temperature, etc. We'll have to do. But yes, in the nursing hostel, I think it's a high risk exposure. Probably I think the close contacts, somebody who is sharing rooms with her, or I would say if some of her flatmate who is actually spending more time with her needs to be definitely screened and needs to be put for the quarantine. I think at the moment I would only think of this, because apart from that, quarantining everybody into the hostel, I think that also doesn't seem to be the correct idea. So probably I think we'll have to be inquiring more and more that with whom she has spent more time, actually the prolonged contact and how close was the contact, and that kind of a nature will have to be.
So this is something which really struck us, because we hadn't thought of such thing before. Because in the hospital, you ensure everybody wears masks, but once they go back to the hostel, they're not wearing masks. So they are all having high risk exposures. So this is also a hot zone for COVID. And, I think many times it doesn't occur where our nurses are staying. And so we quarantined all flatmates for 7 days. They didn't get symptoms, so we didn't test them on exit. So because we again continued the same policy of not testing if they are asymptomatic. And one more thing which you can think here is pool testing in this setting. So suppose you want to test and there's a large number of people, you can sometimes think of doing a pool test and then deciding if the test is positive to screen everybody. And what we did after this is we transferred, because there was that one building with so many nurses, we transferred 1/3 of the staff to other locations, spread them out. We staggered the meal points, meal times. We said there's no mixing between the flats, and also we said that wearing of mask is compulsory even in the hostel. I mean, these are some of the things which we put into place after this event happened, because it can spread like wildfire, COVID in the nursing hostel. And then, you don't know where to admit these people, and you don't know how to manage the hospital. Now, let us come to the 6th case. This is a patient with severe COVID disease who has recovered now, and he's still in the unit. He's being tested regularly from day 14 to day 25 for viral clearance. 9 swabs have been done so far. He's still positive. So, Dr. Priscilla, this patient who is now recovered and is just waiting for his swabs to turn negative, how will you manage this patient? What is happening? What are the national and international guidelines? And what is your opinion about this approach in terms of resource utilization, etc.?
Yes, so Tanu, yes, this is a problem that we are facing actually every day. And this is, I presume, is a common scenario elsewhere. So I think we know that after day 9, the virus is actually unlikely to be cultured from the patient's respiratory secretions. So we know that virus is likely to be non-viable. We assume that the risk of transmissibility is actually low. But at the moment, we are bound by guidelines from the government where we say that we need 2 negative PCRs to actually discharge a patient. And this has actually become a great problem for us as well. There is a possibility of a step-down facility. Unfortunately, in the Vellore area next to CMC, we don't really have a COVID care center. So for us, it's actually a big problem. And we actually have to isolate the patient, continue to keep the patient in our isolation wards. So we know that the patient is probably unlikely to transmit the disease to anybody. If we did have the antibody tests, which would be able to demonstrate a neutralizing antibody, this could probably be taken as the fact that this patient is probably immune. Now, we interestingly did find in some of our patients that they were strongly positive for antibodies, but we did notice that there was a slight spike or rather a dip in the CT value for this patient. So we were unable to actually demonstrate that this is not actually a replicating virus, even though they're strongly antibody positive. And in view of the fact that the antibody testing is all these kits that are there are not validated, it's actually become a huge problem for us as well. So it is really a problem, but we really we are struggling with this every single day, actually. We all know that they're unlikely to transmit the disease, but we're unable to discharge these patients, yes.
So I think maybe as time, or if the epidemic goes out of hand, we might have to send patients home on quarantine. And this is also happening in the US because, there are so many patients that after clinical recovery, they are sending them to home quarantine. And, we just analyzed our data at KDAH, where we found that it took almost 14 days for swab negativity, whether they had mild or severe disease, and range being 9 to even 25 days. And the mean number of swabs done per patient was about 6 to demonstrate clearance. In some patients, it was even 11. And in 30% of the cases, when you did the first swab, it would be negative. And then when you would do a swab the next day, it would come positive. So again, these patients are stuck for time. And then you have to again demonstrate 2 negative swabs. So, and the extra number of days spent in the hospital to demonstrate clearance was 7 to 10 days. So I think at some point in time, especially I think we are looking at a study which can again reinforce the fact that the virus is not culturable in these patients and they can be discharged home. So now we come to the final couple of cases here before we take questions. Our hospital runs obstetric services, and what should be the policy about testing of pregnant women before delivery? And it's okay about patients who are scheduled for an elective cesarean section because there you know when to test them. But what about women who are not scheduled for an elective LSCS? When should they be tested? So maybe I'll probably ask Dr. Ravikant here.
So I think we have an ICMR recommendation for this particular indication that you have to test for pregnant woman who is actually in and around the hotspot area. But if you talk about Mumbai and in my city also, we are actually hotspot. So basically, there is an ICMR recommendation to test pregnant women. And when you talk about timing, they clearly mentioned 5 days before the date of delivery or in the labor. There is one more reason I would tell them that there was an NACL paper which clearly told us that there was the females who delivered into that particular study, 13% of them were infected and majority of them were asymptomatic. So probably I think this is a correct indication to test for pregnant women, specifically if you are in a high prevalence setting like hotspot area, etc.
Yeah, but the main problem here is, when they deliver, you don't know. So, 2 weeks before the expected date of delivery, they can deliver anytime. So sometimes the test, is not valid. You test her today, she doesn't deliver in 5 days, you may have to test her again. And sometimes she may come in labor after the expiry. So those are practical problems when you are testing women who are not scheduled for elective C-section. And now let's come to another case, which is a little different. Like a mother has been diagnosed with COVID-19. She has mild symptoms. She has 2 twins who are aged 3 months. One twin has Fallow's tetralogy who has tested positive, and that twin also has a mild cough. And the other twin is normal and has tested negative. Now the mother has been put on HCQ as is standard here and has been admitted to a hospital with the positive child. So my question to you, Dr. Anup, here is like, how are you going to manage this situation? Like, what is the advice about breastfeeding this baby who's positive? And what about the other baby? Is he like truly negative because he's been in close contact with his mother who tested positive? And so should you separate this baby from the mother and give that baby formula feeds? Dr. Anu, please unmute yourself.
Yes. Yeah. So Dr. Tanu, 2 things. One is about the breastfeeding part. Now the CDC website says that this virus is not seen in the breast milk, and hence there is no contraindication to breastfeeding even if the mother is positive. That's what the CDC website says, that it is not found in the breast milk and hence you can continue to breastfeed. Now, it goes on to say that if the mother is asymptomatic, then she can wear a surgical mask and actually give the breast milk. But if she is symptomatic, like in this case, she was mildly symptomatic, where you can have an option of giving express breast milk to the baby who is negative. Now, regarding your question whether the other baby is truly negative, like we have discussed about the fallacies of the RT-PCR earlier, and it is very highly likely what you mentioned, they have high risk contact. Obviously, it is not, they are not masked or etc. So the risk of contact is definitely there. Whether the baby should be separated, so that is something maybe better you can come in and answer. I'm not very sure about that. But two things I'm very sure: there is no contraindication for breastfeeding. And since the one of the child is tested positive, the mother can probably wear a mask and continue to breastfeed. For other express breast milk can be considered.
Yeah, so one more thing is that if the baby is already positive, there's no problem with breastfeeding because the mother is positive, baby is positive. So there's no problem at all. The only problem is whether HCQ can be transmitted through the breast milk, so the levels are not high, so it is safe for the baby. Because once both are positive, then, breastfeeding is not kind of a contraindication. Generally, it is believed that if the other baby has been in contact with the mother for 2 days, and babies usually handle the illness well, and this baby doesn't have a comorbidity like the other positive baby, it may be actually sensible to just keep the baby with the mother and continue breastfeeding, because if the mother is in hospital, even giving express breast milk to the other baby is going to be difficult. Who's going to transport it? So that's what then the guidelines are, that if the mother is positive and she delivers, and if the baby can be separated from the mother at birth, you separate the two. But otherwise, if resources are not there, you keep them together. I think with that, let us go to the last case here. Skipping one case, this is again a situation like our intensivist was the first to rotate through the COVID unit. After exiting from the unit, gets mild symptoms and he tests positive. He recovers now. And it's been 6 weeks since we've started the unit. He's due to rotate in the unit again. He's concerned about reinfection. So here I want to ask maybe Dr. Priscilla about, what if a healthcare worker gets COVID and recovers from the COVID? Is it safe to put them back into the COVID unit because they have suffered the illness, and in one way it makes sense because they are immune? Or is it possible that if they get reinfected, they may have severe disease? The WHO is also saying that if you get the disease, you are not protected again. So what is your response to this?
Okay, so Tanu, this is a question I've been asked as well in my practice. So first thing is, we don't know how long the immunity lasts. So the durability of immunity due to one infection is unknown at this point in time. So whether it's going to last for a while, a year or 2 years, we don't really know. So the thing about reinfection akin to dengue, now we know that pathogenesis for the previous SARS virus has shown that there is some amount of antibody-dependent enhancement. But it's important to remember when it's dengue, it is actually a different strain which actually contributes to the antibody-dependent enhancement. So it is unlikely in this short duration of period to say that the virus has mutated to such an extent that is actually a different strain, and so it is likely to cause an antibody-dependent enhancement. So at this point in time, I don't think we can really categorically say that the virus can mutate in this short duration of period and actually be a different strain and thus cause an antibody dependent enhancement and so cause a worse disease when he becomes reinfected the second time. I don't think we have that data as yet. We're not even sure how durable the immunity is likely to be. So I would actually counsel him and tell him that he probably does have immunity for a durable period of time. We don't know how long that period is. Is it weeks? Is it months? Is it a year? We don't really know it. But I would actually counsel him and reassure him that the virus would take some time to actually mutate to a different strain, which is likely to cause an antibody-dependent enhancement.
Yeah, and we just want to tell that it's not. I feel that the COVID unit is there's a lesser risk to get the infection if you're working in a COVID unit as compared to a non-COVID unit, because when you're going into a COVID unit, you're wearing full PPE. and you are taking all the precautions, you're meeting a known enemy. Whereas when you're working outside the hospital, you can have any patient who's an asymptomatic carrier from whom you can get infected. So the thing is, so that is also something which people need to understand, that the risk of infection is in any area of the hospital if the epidemic kind of progresses. And when we analyzed the data from our hospital of the 6 healthcare persons who have tested positive so far, amongst a staff of 2 or 3,000, one only was from the COVID unit. The rest are from other areas who are probably, who had, one was working in the call center, one was in an OT where pre-op testing is being done, one was in the other non-COVID ICU. So basically, it doesn't mean that, when you are going inside a COVID unit, you are at very heightened risk because you're going with full PPE. So I think with that, I would like to say that, COVID is so challenging, and that what makes it so challenging is the infection control issue, because here is the first case where we are concerned more about the health of the healthcare workers, etc., as compared to the patient themselves. I mean, no other time have I heard so much discussion about infection control and transmission to healthcare workers, because automatically we always think of the patient. And therefore, this is to mitigate the risk of transmission to healthcare workers and other patients in the hospital. And there are lots of guideline statements which are there. But each center has to work out its own strategy about how they're going to manage. And one thing which is very important is that there should be one nodal place where all these things are handled: healthcare workers' exposures, healthcare worker symptoms, because so that uniformity is there. And most of the times you have to decide on the basis of common sense and rationality, and just hope for the best. I think with that, I would like to kind of stop the meeting and take a few questions from the people. Luckily, we don't have many questions, but I'm just going to read out the question. So there is a question which says that literature says sometime viral clearance may take 31 days in severe cases. So Dr. Priscilla, what would you say about this? Viral clearance takes a long time, but are these people infectious?
Okay, so we do know that patients can actually be positive as long as 48 days. I think longest described was from China, where a patient was positive for almost 48 days. We also have a patient who's been in hospital almost 40 days and continues to be positive. We do know that the patient is unlikely to be infectious. We know that we are unable to culture the virus after day 9. We know that antibodies become strongly positive by day 12 to day 14. So the chances that the patient is actually infectious is probably very, very, very low. But at the moment, we are unable to make that recommendation simply because, for example, we are unable to culture the virus here because we don't have a BSL-3 facility. So for us to even discharge the patient and be sure that there is no resurgence of the viral load is difficult. So that is the reason why we are not just bound by what the government dictates, but also because we are unsure as to really what it means. Common sense dictates that the patient will not be infectious at all, or if at all, at very, very low risk.
So somebody is saying, Dr. Ravikant, one person is saying that the patient who was persistently positive, can staying in the COVID ward itself be the reason for the swab positivity? Do you think he is clearing the virus and getting reinfected again? Is that a possibility?
I think probably this persistent positivity of RT-PCR is only just that we are detecting possible non-viable genetic material from the patient secretion. That's all. Otherwise, I think as rightly pointed out by Dr. Priscilla, that there was a paper in Nature which clearly told us that between 8 to 10 days is the last limit. Actually, viruses, we are able to culture the virus. Probably, I think this persistent positivity is only the positivity due to the genetic element rather than the viral virus.
So, Dr. Anup, this question is for you, because I know in Kerala there are some people who are doing expert. There's a question: how good is expert for COVID testing? Because that person has heard that there are discordant results with the other RT-PCR kits. Dr. Anup.
So here the prime use of this gene expert has been for screening for emergency surgeries. So that's what we've been approved for in the state of Kerala. So the government had 3 centers in South, Central Kerala and North, and primarily the use has been only for screening emergency surgeries. That's how the whole purpose that it was used for. And in those, I mean, we are not confirmed with going ahead because they have sanctioned it as a confirmatory test. So the gene expert Cepheid, the ICMR has sanctioned it as a confirmatory test. So hence we are not following it up through with the traditional RT-PCR. So hence in my state, the data, I have no data on discordance at all because of these two reasons.
Should be working well. However, what we have seen is it is little kit dependent because we have used 3 type of kits. One is the Altona kits for RT-PCR, one is the MyLab, and the other is the Thermo Fisher. And what we found is that the Altona actually works best because some cases we have done on both. So that is the experience which we have, but we have no experience with Cepheid. Now there is a question here. An ICU nurse was COVID positive and is now IgG positive. She's cleared for service. So does she still need level 3 PPE for COVID ICU work? Dr. Ravikant, what would be your answer to that?
Yeah, probably again, I think it is the repeat question. Actually, we look, as Dr. Priscilla said, that at the moment we don't know whether we have a partially neutralizing antibody or a complete neutralizing antibody, for how long the antibodies are going to give you that amount of protection. So if you are positive, you are cleared, you have developed antibody, it does not mean that you undergo infection control practices. I think you have to adhere to the infection control practices, despite that you have got an infection and now you are cleared. That is going to be my take on this.
There's another question which says that wearing gloves, does it score over hand hygiene? Because as part of so if you have nurses working in non-COVID areas where you don't know, there may be other patients. Dr. Anup, would you like to take this? Does it score over hand hygiene?
I think we are following it's as a part of the contact precaution. Like when we talk about the transmission-based precautions for COVID, we are talking about droplet plus contact without aerosol generating procedure and airborne plus contact when you are talking about aerosol borne generator. So this gloves as a PPE is a part of contact precautions, and hence, in spite of using the gloves, we know that there is a moment of hand hygiene where we have to practice hand hygiene after removal of the PPE also. So I will not say that the gloves discounts the use of or practice of hand hygiene. It is just an addition as a PPE, as a part of contact precautions.
So there's another question which says that, hello doctors, do you recommend all the healthcare workers to get tested for COVID weekly once for their safety? We've already discussed that.
I don't think any of us will enjoy having something poked into our nose every week.
And because the outcome is even worse. I mean, if you test positive, it's better. Ignorance is bliss, I think. So there's another question which says that, are we insisting less on wearing caps? Means what is the caps? I mean, do you think caps are really important as part of PPE?
So this is a little difficult, Dr. Tanu, because if you look at, say, in terms of, if you look at contact precautions or the list of PPE from the CDC and all, so they say that you need splash prevention, and to prevent splash, you have a gown and you have a face shield, and you wear goggles or something to prevent splash into your eyes and prevent contact with mucous membrane. And then you need an N95 or a surgical mask in terms of whether droplet or airborne. So actually a head cap doesn't figure in this list of the PPE which are described as transmission-based precautions.
So there's another question, Dr. Priscilla. It says that prophylaxis HCQs for healthcare professionals is recommended by ICMR. Have all the panelists taken HCQs? So I have not taken HCQ, and other people, can they volunteer?
No, I have not taken HCQ.
No, I haven't taken it either. And so we offer it to healthcare workers, but we make them sign an informed consent actually. Our informed consent has data about what data is actually available with regard to chloroquine prophylaxis, which is really zero. So we actually tell them that we offer it, but we don't really advocate it. That's about it. So no, I haven't taken. And how long to take it? If they say 7 days, 7 weeks, weekly, 7 weeks, then what about that? We're going to be a healthcare worker for the rest of our lives. So I'm not sure it really makes sense.
So there is a question in OPD, should we use gloves when we examine all our patients? There's a question. I mean, should people who are sitting in the OPD always wear gloves?
Let me say what I do in my OPD. I don't wear gloves unless there is some other reason to do so, but I do perform hand hygiene before and after. We have a sink in our room. I think as long as the principle of hand hygiene is maintained, whether you do that with changing the gloves or whether you do that with hand hygiene, I think the basic premise is the same. Just make sure that you practice hand hygiene to prevent transmission to yourself and to prevent transmission to the patient after.
So there's another question about, we have just 5 more minutes. So we have another question about COVID testing for primary angioplasty and elective angioplasty. Dr. Ravikant, maybe you could take, when no history or symptoms of COVID, would you recommend testing?
Yeah, so asymptomatic patients, asymptomatic person definitely needs not to be tested. But yes, when it comes to the pre-procedural testing, right, which means somebody wants to do angioplasty. So there are two things which comes into picture. If the person is symptomatic with a compatible clinical picture and you want to perform a procedure, which is angioplasty or angiography, then one is that. Suppose if you have an in-house PCR, it is going to be 6 to 8 hours minimal before you get the report. Second, if you go the guidelines recommended by American Heart Association, they clearly say even in the COVID times, for a ST elevation MI, primary PCI remains the standard of care. Which means if you have a patient who is going to go for STEMI and a PCI, who is going to go for PCI for a STEMI, needs to be tested for COVID. I think that's going to be the way forward in these kind of patients.
Okay, so I mean, so somebody's asked a question about what is the minimum PPE required in an ENT OPD?
So again, you know, ENT OPD, I would say that in most of the ENT OP patients, they would have some or other respiratory complaints in terms of their specialty specific practice. So if suppose somebody has a respiratory symptoms, then definitely the guidelines clearly mention that you at least wear mask and a face protection or a goggles. Apart from that, routine standard hand hygiene is more than sufficient into OPD. But I don't think that if somebody who has no respiratory symptoms and you are seeing that particular patient for a brief interaction, apart from a routine surgical mask, you really need the face shield and other protection. I don't really think you need.
Okay, there's another question here that a healthcare worker who's confirmed COVID positive and has been treated and also has shown 2 negative PCR before discharge, when can the healthcare worker join back his work? So Dr. Anup, would you like to take this question? Because the guidelines say 2 weeks of home quarantine after 2 negative swabs.
I think as per the regulations, we have to complete the 2 weeks of quarantine. That is what the regulations from the ICMR and the state medical boards also state. In terms of infectivity, we have reiterated it multiple times that we are not really bothered or we are not concerned about the infectivity, but definitely the state that we have to complete 2 weeks of home quarantine.
Yeah, so I mean, the guidelines say so, but sometimes, you know, if you have paucity of healthcare workers, these people may have to join back earlier as well, because as going forward from here, if the epidemic increases, that may be. So I think with that, there are other questions, but we have a session again tomorrow, which is Ask the Expert session. And in that session, some of these questions can be transferred. And with that, I would like to kind of come to an end to this discussion. And I thank my panelists for their inputs and how precisely they answered the questions. And I hope that the audience also had some of their queries answered. And sometimes it is that, you know, these questions raise more queries, but I think we'll solve them as we go along. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Tanu.
Thank you, Dr. Tanu, for putting up this excellent show, real life case scenarios, which highlights the problems with respect to infection control. Thanks for the time. I thank Dr. Anup from Kochi who joined, and then Dr. Priscilla from Vellore, and then Dr. Ravikant. And I think infection control with respect to COVID has more questions than clear-cut answers. But the take-home message that I would like to stress is guidelines are for guidelines. we need to adapt to the local needs of that particular hospital or the particular unit, plus look into the local area of the prevalence and incidence of the disease. I think all those factors has to be figured in before adapting these guidelines. That is something that we have to think before practicing the guidelines into our day-to-day management of COVID patients. And I thank viewers for joining in for this session. And tomorrow it's going to be an open session. There is no topic for the session. And all we're going to have is 4 experts and one moderator. The moderator will be Dr. Ashwini, and the experts will be George K. Verghese from Bangalore. And then you have Sunita Naredi from Hyderabad, Dr. Ram Gopal Krishnan from Chennai, and then Dr. Neha Gupta from New Delhi. The questions that have been left unanswered with respect to the previous webinars, plus this current webinar, this lecture, plus the previous 2 lectures, will all be keyed in this session. And I thank the panelists and the moderator, Dr. Tanu, for sparing the time. And thank you. Very good evening. Bye for now. We'll see you again tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Tanu. Good show. Good. Thank you.